Appalachian foothills, Western Virginia, late autumn 1876. While experienced builders across 3 counties prepared their families for another brutal mountain winter, a 22-year-old carpenter's son named Thomas Brennan was about to make what neighbors called the most foolish construction decision they'd ever witnessed. His father, Samuel Brennan, had spent 40 years building chimneys and hearths throughout the valley. Thomas had learned every traditional technique: the proper draft angles, the standard firebox dimensions, the accepted stone-to-mortar ratios. But that October, as he began constructing the heating system for his own small cabin, Thomas announced he would ignore nearly everything his father had taught him. "He's wasting good stone," muttered James Hartley, a master mason who'd built over 60 fireplaces in the region. "That boy's putting twice the rock where it don't belong." What Thomas understood about heat storage would not just warm his family through the winter of 1876. It would challenge every assumption the valley's builders held about efficient heating, and it would do so during one of the coldest winters the region had ever recorded. Before we reveal what this young man discovered, do me a favor: hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching from and whether your winters get cold enough to make heating a life or death concern. I promise, what you're about to learn could change how you think about staying warm with minimal resources. Thomas Brennan's cabin sat on a modest plot 3 miles east of the main settlement. The structure itself followed conventional Appalachian design: hewn logs, clay chinking, a simple gable roof. But the heating system Thomas began installing in October 1876 defied every principle his community considered fundamental. Traditional fireplaces of that era followed a consistent pattern: a relatively shallow firebox, approximately 18 inches deep, with a narrow chimney designed to create strong draft. The goal was simple: burn hot, exhaust fast, repeat. Most families went through a cord of hardwood every 12 to 14 days during deep winter. Thomas's design looked wrong from the first day. He excavated a pit extending 4 feet below the cabin floor, directly beneath where his firebox would sit. Into this cavity, he placed over 2,800 pounds of river stone, dense, water-smooth granite and sandstone collected from the creek bed half a mile downslope. His neighbors watched with mounting disbelief as he dedicated 3 full weeks to this underground foundation. "You're building a root cellar under a fireplace?" asked Michael Doran, whose own cabin stood just across the ridge. "That stone's gonna drink heat like a drunk drinks whiskey. Won't give nothing back." But Thomas wasn't finished. Above this stone foundation, he constructed a firebox that was both smaller and deeper than conventional designs. Only 24 inches wide, but extending 26 inches back into the chimney mass. Then came the detail that provoked the most ridicule. He built the rear and side walls of his firebox using stone blocks that extended 18 inches into the cabin's interior wall structure, creating what he called heat ribs. His father, Samuel, tried intervening. "Son, that firebox is too tight. Won't get proper combustion. And all that extra stone in the walls. You're just creating cold spots where heat can't penetrate." Thomas listened respectfully, then continued exactly as planned. The chimney itself broke with tradition. Rather than shooting straight up to create maximum draft, Thomas incorporated 2 gentle angles, one at 6 feet, another at 11 feet, creating what he described as heat pockets. Each angle featured additional stone mass, carefully mortared with clay mixed with a specific proportion of sand. Thomas had calculated based on principles he'd read about in a book on European masonry techniques. By early November, as the first hard frost began settling into the valley, Thomas's heating system stood complete. The total stone mass integrated into the fireplace, chimney, and underground foundation exceeded 6,400 pounds, more than triple what a conventional fireplace would use. "Brennan's boy has built a monument to his own ignorance," declared James Hartley at the general store. "Come January, he'll be the coldest fool in the valley, sitting next to the heaviest pile of frozen rock in Virginia." What none of them understood was that Thomas hadn't been designing a fireplace. He'd been building a battery, one that would store and release thermal energy in ways their conventional systems couldn't approach. The physics Thomas Brennan had stumbled upon were both ancient and misunderstood by his contemporaries. While experienced builders focused on combustion efficiency and draft strength, Thomas had become obsessed with a different question. How could he capture and hold heat, rather than simply generate it? His answer lay in thermal mass and radiant heat distribution. Traditional Appalachian fireplaces operated on what engineers would later call a high-throughput, low-retention model. Wood burned hot, often reaching 1,200 to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit in the firebox. The heat rose quickly through the chimney, warming the immediate area through convection and some radiant heat from the firebox opening. But the moment the fire died down, the warmth dissipated rapidly. The stone and brick in conventional designs simply didn't have sufficient mass or proper positioning to absorb and slowly release that thermal energy. Thomas's system worked differently. The 2,800 pounds of stone beneath his firebox created what modern engineers call a thermal sink. During active burning, heat conducted downward through the firebox floor, a direction conventional builders considered wasteful. But this heat didn't vanish. It saturated the stone foundation, raising its temperature slowly but steadily. River stone, particularly granite and sandstone, has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means Thomas's underground foundation alone could store roughly 560 BTUs for every degree it warmed. The heat ribs extending into his cabin walls served a different function. These 18-inch stone protrusions acted as radiators, absorbing heat from the firebox and chimney mass, then releasing it into the living space through radiant heat transfer. Unlike convection, which requires constant air movement and heat input, radiant heat continues as long as the stone remains warmer than the surrounding air. The angled chimney design proved equally clever. Each bend created turbulence that slowed the exhaust gases, giving them more time to transfer heat into the surrounding stone mass. This reduced draft efficiency by approximately 15%, something conventional builders would consider unacceptable. But it increased heat retention in the chimney structure by an estimated 40 to 50%. Thomas had tested his theory during construction using a simple experiment. He'd heated stones in a conventional fire, then timed how long they remained warm enough to radiate noticeable heat. River stones, when properly heated, stayed warm to the touch for 6 to 8 hours. Limestone crumbled under repeated heating cycles. Sandstone and granite proved most reliable. When Michael Doran visited in mid-November and saw Thomas's careful calculations, scribbled notes about stone weights, heat capacity, and burning duration, he shook his head. "You're thinking too hard about this, Tom. Fire warms. Stone don't. Simple as that." But Thomas knew something Doran didn't. Stone doesn't warm quickly, but once warm, it doesn't cool quickly either. And in a structure designed to maximize thermal mass rather than maximize flame, that property became an advantage rather than a limitation. His neighbors built their fires hot and fed them constantly. Thomas planned to build smaller, longer-burning fires that would gradually charge his stone battery throughout the day. Then, he theorized, that stored heat would radiate through the night and into the following day, requiring far less wood and far less labor. If you're finding this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment. Have you ever been doubted for trying something different? Let me know below. The final element of Thomas's design came from observation rather than calculation. He'd noticed that his father's fireplaces, despite their strong draft, often created cold spots in cabin corners while overheating the immediate hearth area. Air circulation was chaotic, driven by the intense convection from the open firebox. Thomas's smaller firebox opening, only 24 inches wide compared to the typical 36 to 40 inches, created gentler convection currents. Meanwhile, the radiant heat from his wall-embedded stone ribs provided more even warmth distribution throughout the single-room cabin. He predicted this would eliminate the common complaint of frozen back, burning face that plagued conventional designs. By late November 1876, as temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, Thomas began his first sustained burns. His wife, Margaret, was 7 months pregnant with their first child. The cabin needed to stay warm, not just for comfort, but for survival. The valley's experienced builders waited for vindication. They expected Thomas's heavy stone mass would take days to warm up, leaving his family shivering while he fed fire after fire into his foolish design. What happened instead would shake their assumptions to bedrock. December 3rd, 1876. Temperature at dawn, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas Brennan lit his first full-day fire in the new system. He used 18 pounds of seasoned oak, arranged in a configuration he practiced. Larger splits at the back of the deep firebox, smaller kindling toward the front, with careful attention to airflow through the reduced opening. By midday, the cabin's interior temperature reached 64 degrees. By evening, 67 degrees. Michael Doran, visiting to check on Margaret, expected the temperature to plummet overnight as the fire burned down to coals. At dawn on December 4th, with outside temperature at 16 degrees, the cabin's interior still measured 61 degrees. Thomas had added only 3 small splits during the night, perhaps 6 pounds of wood total. Luck, Doran muttered. Wait until real winter hits. Real winter arrived on December 18th. An Arctic front swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures across Western Virginia to levels the region hadn't experienced in nearly a decade. On December 20th, the overnight low hit 7 degrees Fahrenheit. On December 21st, it fell to 2 degrees. On December 22nd, just 3 days before Christmas, the mercury dropped to 6 degrees below zero. In conventional cabins across the valley, families fought desperately to maintain livable temperatures. James Hartley's household burned through nearly half a cord of wood during those 4 brutal days, roughly 280 pounds of hardwood. His interior temperature, despite constant fire tending, fluctuated between 52 and 58 degrees, with corners of the cabin dropping into the low 40s. Michael Doran's family fared slightly better with 55 to 60 degrees, but only by burning through 240 pounds of wood and maintaining someone on fire watch throughout the night. Thomas Brennan's cabin, by contrast, maintained a steady 63 to 68 degrees. His total wood consumption during those 4 days, 86 pounds. The difference wasn't just comfort, it was physics made visible. Thomas's thermal mass system had reached what engineers would later call thermal saturation. The 6,400 pounds of stone in his foundation, walls, and chimney had absorbed and stored so much heat over the previous 2 weeks that they now functioned as a massive radiator. Even when the firebox contained only glowing coals, the stone continued releasing stored thermal energy at a rate of approximately 180 to 200 BTUs per hour. On December 23rd, Thomas conducted an experiment that would become legendary in the valley. At dawn, with outside temperature at 4 degrees, he let his fire burn down completely to ash. He did not add any new wood. By noon, the cabin temperature had dropped only to 64 degrees, a loss of just 3 degrees in 6 hours. By evening, it reached 59 degrees. By the following dawn, Christmas Eve morning, 24 hours after the last wood had been added, the interior temperature stood at 54 degrees. Outside temperature, -2 degrees Fahrenheit. His neighbors couldn't explain it. Samuel Brennan, Thomas's father, came to examine the system personally. He placed his hand on the stone ribs extending from the firebox into the cabin wall. Even 26 hours after the last fire, the stone remained noticeably warm. "How long will it hold?" Samuel asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Thomas admitted, "but I think longer than anyone expects." What Thomas had created was a thermal flywheel, a system where the massive stone battery, once charged, would resist temperature change in either direction. The stone didn't heat quickly, but it didn't cool quickly either. And with proper management, maintaining that charge required only a fraction of the wood his neighbors consumed. Margaret Brennan gave birth on January 8, 1877. The midwife, arriving during a snowstorm with outside temperatures near 10 degrees, found the cabin interior at a comfortable 66 degrees. Thomas had burned 12 pounds of wood that morning, enough to boost the thermal mass slightly and ensure his wife's comfort during labor. I've attended births in cabins where we could see our breath, the midwife told neighbors afterward. In Thomas's place, I had to remove my shawl. That boy's done something nobody else has figured out. But the true test, the one that would cement Thomas's reputation and force his neighbors to abandon their skepticism, was still to come. January 14th, 1877. Thomas Brennan made a decision that his neighbors considered either brilliantly confident or dangerously reckless. He announced he would burn only one fire per week for the remainder of winter. The valley's builders scoffed. He's going to freeze that newborn baby and his wife, James Hartley declared. Stone holds some heat, sure, but not for 7 days. Physics don't work that way. Hartley was wrong about the physics. Thomas's system had reached optimal thermal saturation by mid-January. The 6,400 pounds of stone mass had stabilized at what he estimated was approximately 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire integrated structure. At this saturation point, the stone released heat at a remarkably steady rate, roughly 170 to 190 BTUs per hour, enough to offset heat loss through the cabin's log walls and roof even during cold nights. On January 15th, Thomas built a carefully planned fire using 22 pounds of seasoned oak. He burned it hot for approximately 6 hours, allowing the flames to superheat the stone mass back to near-peak temperature. Then he let it die completely. For the next 7 days, he added no wood whatsoever. Michael Doran tracked the results obsessively, visiting daily with a mercury thermometer he'd purchased specifically to document what he expected would be Thomas's failure. Day 1, no fire interior temperature range from 66 degrees Fahrenheit, dawn, to 69 degrees Fahrenheit, afternoon. Day 2, 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 3, 63 degrees Fahrenheit to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 4, 61 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 5, 59 degrees Fahrenheit to 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 6, 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 7, 56 degrees Fahrenheit to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperatures during this period range from 12 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. On day 7, Thomas built another fire, slightly larger this time, 26 pounds of oak. Within hours, the interior temperature climbed back to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and stabilized. Doran stared at his recorded numbers. This shouldn't be possible. You're using maybe 30 pounds of wood per week. I'm burning through that in a single cold night. The mathematics of Thomas's efficiency were staggering. Over a 30-day winter period, a conventional Appalachian cabin consumed approximately 2 to 2.5 cords of hardwood, roughly 3,600 to 4,500 pounds of wood. This required near-constant fire management, regular overnight feeding, and still resulted in temperature fluctuations that left families cold during morning hours. Thomas's system, maintaining higher and more stable temperatures, consumed approximately 120 to 140 pounds of wood over that same 30-day period, a reduction of roughly 96% in fuel consumption. But the truly remarkable demonstration came in late February. On February 18th, 1877, Thomas built what he announced would be his last fire until late March. He used 34 pounds of prime, seasoned oak, burned slowly over 8 hours to maximize heat transfer into the stone mass. Then, with outside temperatures still regularly dropping into the teens at night, he walked away from his fireplace entirely. His neighbors predicted disaster within a week. Instead, Thomas's cabin remained comfortably habitable for 35 consecutive days. The temperature gradually declined, following a logarithmic curve that reflected the slow cooling of his massive thermal battery. By day 10, interior temperatures ranged from 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. By day 20, 54 degrees Fahrenheit to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. By day 30, 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. On March 25th, 35 days after the last fire, the cabin's interior temperature at dawn measured 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit, with spring clearly arriving. Thomas finally built another fire, more to celebrate the experiment's success than from necessity. If this is blowing your mind, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. Comment below. Where are you watching from? Does your area get brutal winters? I want to hear from you. Samuel Brennan visited on March 26th. He examined every aspect of his son's heating system with the careful attention of a craftsman confronting something he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. "I taught you everything I knew about building fireplaces," Samuel said quietly. "Turns out I didn't know the most important thing." "What's that?" Thomas asked. "That the goal isn't burning wood. It's storing the heat that burning creates." Spring 1877 brought more than warming temperatures to the Appalachian foothills. It brought a quiet revolution in how the valley's builders understood heat. James Hartley was the first to ask Thomas for details. The master mason who'd called the design a monument to ignorance appeared at Thomas's door on April 3rd with a leather-bound notebook and genuine humility. "I need to understand the stone placement," Hartley said simply. "The angles, the mass calculations, everything." Thomas spent 3 hours walking Hartley through every element of the system. He explained the underground thermal foundation, why river stone worked better than quarried limestone, why depth mattered, why the total mass needed to exceed 2,500 pounds minimum to achieve meaningful heat storage. He detailed the heat ribs extending into the walls, their optimal length of 16 to 20 inches, their spacing to maximize radiant coverage without creating structural weakness. Most importantly, Thomas shared his operational philosophy. You're not feeding a fire. You're charging a battery. Think in days, not hours. Hartley filled 14 notebook pages with measurements, sketches, and calculations. By late April, he'd begun construction on a modified heating system for the widow Patterson, whose husband had died the previous winter partly from exhaustion caused by constant fire tending. Hartley incorporated Thomas's thermal mass principles but adapted them for the widow's smaller cabin, reducing total stone mass to 4,200 pounds and creating a more compact firebox suitable for her reduced fuel-gathering capacity. The system worked beautifully. During the following winter of 1877 to 78, widow Patterson burned approximately 60% less wood than her late husband had consumed, while maintaining warmer and more stable interior temperatures. Michael Doran took longer to accept the new approach. His pride had been wounded by months of skepticism proven wrong. But when his wife, Catherine, mentioned during Sunday services that she'd spent the previous winter constantly cold despite Michael's exhausting fire maintenance schedule, something shifted. In June 1877, Doran approached Thomas with an unusual request. "I don't want to rebuild my whole fireplace. Can your system work as a modification to what I've already got?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Depends on your foundation and your chimney structure. Let me look at it." Together, they developed what became known in the valley as a Brennan retrofit, a method for adding thermal mass to existing fireplaces without complete reconstruction. The technique involved excavating beneath the existing firebox to add a stone foundation layer, then building heat-absorbing stone masses into the walls adjacent to the chimney. While not as efficient as Thomas's original integrated design, these retrofits still improved heat retention by an estimated 40 to 50%, while reducing wood consumption by 30 to 40%. By autumn 1877, 11 households in the valley had either built new Brennan-style heating systems or retrofitted their existing fireplaces with thermal mass enhancements. The results during the winter of 1877 to 78 were consistent and measurable. Families reported wood consumption reduced by 50 to 70% compared to previous winters. Interior temperature fluctuations reduced from typical 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit daily swings to 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit swings. Elimination of overnight fire feeding requirements in properly built systems. Warmer temperatures in cabin corners and distant areas due to radiant heat distribution, but perhaps the most significant change was philosophical rather than technical. Builders began asking different questions. Instead of "how hot can I make this fire?" they asked, "how much heat can this stone hold?" Instead of designing for maximum combustion, they designed for maximum retention. The focus shifted from the fire itself to the thermal battery surrounding it. Thomas's father, Samuel, incorporated the principles into his professional work. By 1878, he'd built or supervised construction of 23 thermal mass heating systems across 3 counties. Each incorporated the core Brennan principles: substantial underground stone foundation, heat ribs extending into living spaces, angled chimneys for exhaust heat recovery, and operational protocols focused on thermal charging rather than continuous burning. Samuel's adaptation included refinements based on specific conditions. For wealthy households with access to quarried stone, he specified granite or dense sandstone cut to uniform dimensions for optimal heat transfer. For poorer families, he taught techniques for selecting and testing river stones, the same knowledge Thomas had developed through experimentation. The economic impact rippled beyond just fuel savings. Families spending fewer hours gathering and processing firewood had more time for other productive activities. Women, who traditionally bore much of the burden of fire tending, found themselves with significantly reduced labor. Children could sleep through the night without being awakened to feed fires. Winter illness rates appeared to decline as well, though precise records from this era are incomplete. Local oral histories suggest that the more stable interior temperatures reduced respiratory ailments and cold-related sickness, particularly among infants and elderly residents. By 1880, an estimated 47 cabins and homes within a 50-mile radius had incorporated Brennan thermal mass principles into their heating systems. The technique had spread through the practical validation only harsh winters can provide. It worked, it saved labor, and it saved resources. Thomas himself continued refining the approach. In 1879, he built an experimental system for a 2-room cabin that incorporated separate thermal masses for each room, allowing differential heating based on occupancy. In 1881, he designed a larger system for the valley's new church building, scaling the principles to heat a space that could accommodate 60 people. Not every implementation succeeded perfectly. Some builders, misunderstanding the principles, created systems with too little stone mass or improper firebox dimensions. These hybrid failures burned wood inefficiently while providing inadequate heat storage. Thomas spent considerable time during the late 1870s troubleshooting failed systems and teaching the critical importance of proper proportions. You can't just add some stone and call it thermal mass, he explained to one frustrated builder whose modification had failed. The ratios matter. The placement matters. The stone quality matters. This isn't about adding weight. It's about creating a heat battery with proper capacity and proper discharge rates. By the early 1880s, what had begun as one young man's silly idea had become accepted wisdom across the region. New construction increasingly incorporated thermal mass heating as standard practice rather than experimental innovation. The technique had proven itself through the harshest test available: survival through Appalachian winters. The spring of 1885 brought an unusual visitor to Thomas Brennan's door. Professor Edward Mitchell from the Virginia School of Mines and Engineering had heard accounts of the valley's unusual heating systems and traveled specifically to document what he called vernacular thermal engineering. Mitchell spent 3 days measuring, calculating, and interviewing. His subsequent paper, published in the Journal of Applied Engineering in 1886, provided the first academic validation of principles that frontier families had been using successfully for nearly a decade. Mitchell's calculations confirmed what Thomas had discovered through experimentation. A properly designed thermal mass heating system could achieve heat retention efficiency of 70 to 80%, compared to conventional fireplaces that retained perhaps 20 to 30% of generated heat. The difference wasn't marginal, it was transformative. What's remarkable, Mitchell wrote, is not that these principles work, but that they've been independently rediscovered by Carpenter's son with no formal engineering education. The physics involved, thermal capacity, radiant heat transfer, controlled convection, are well understood in academic circles. Yet our practical application in residential heating has been nearly non-existent. These Appalachian builders have demonstrated that traditional academic knowledge means little if it doesn't translate to human benefit. But Thomas Brennan's innovation represented more than just efficient heating. It embodied a broader principle about the nature of knowledge itself. The Valley's experienced builders, men like James Hartley and Samuel Brennan, had possessed deep practical knowledge accumulated over decades. They understood wood combustion, chimney draft, stone masonry, and structural integrity. Yet they'd missed something fundamental because their knowledge had calcified into unchangeable assumptions. Thomas, with less experience but more curiosity, had questioned those assumptions. He'd asked, "What if?" when others said, "We've always done it this way." His willingness to appear foolish, to endure mockery and doubt, had created space for genuine innovation. This pattern repeats throughout human history. The expert often knows too much to question foundational premises. The novice, unburdened by expertise's weight, sometimes sees possibilities the master has learned to dismiss. Consider what Thomas's innovation required: willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, patience to test ideas despite social pressure, humility to learn from failure during experimentation, confidence to trust observations over accepted practice, generosity to share knowledge freely once validated. These qualities, not superior intelligence or special insight, enabled the breakthrough. The thermal mass heating principles Thomas developed weren't entirely original. European builders had used similar approaches for centuries in different forms. Russian stove designs, Scandinavian masonry heaters, and Korean ondol systems all incorporated thermal mass concepts. What Thomas had done was rediscover and adapt these principles for Appalachian conditions using locally available materials and construction methods. This speaks to another crucial point. Innovation isn't always about inventing something entirely new. Sometimes it's about recognizing valuable ideas from other contexts and adapting them to local needs. Thomas had read about European masonry techniques in a borrowed book. He'd taken concepts designed for different climates and different building traditions, then tailored them to Virginia's specific challenges. By the late 1880s, thermal mass heating had become sufficiently established that newer builders entering the valley simply learned it as standard practice. They didn't know they were using Brennan's method. They just knew this was how you built an efficient fireplace. Thomas himself lived until 1923, dying at age 68. He witnessed the gradual displacement of wood heating by coal, then the early arrival of oil heat in wealthier homes. He saw his own innovation become obsolete, not because it failed, but because energy became cheap and abundant enough that efficiency no longer mattered as much. Yet the principles he'd validated never lost their relevance. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, families returning to wood heat rediscovered the value of thermal mass systems. During the energy crises of the 1970s, a new generation of builders studying passive solar design and thermal mass heating found themselves reinventing principles Thomas had proven a century earlier. Today, as interest in off-grid living, energy efficiency, and sustainable heating continues growing, Thomas Brennan's core insights remain perfectly valid. The physics haven't changed. Stone still absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Thermal mass still provides stability that combustion alone cannot achieve. Radiant heat still distributes more evenly than convective heat. Modern implementations use improved materials: soapstone with superior thermal properties, engineered masonry units with optimized density, even phase-change materials that store heat more efficiently than stone. But the fundamental principle remains Thomas's insight: heat storage matters more than heat generation. The broader lesson extends beyond heating systems. In our modern era, we often assume that newer means better, that traditional approaches are primitive or inefficient, that expertise always trumps experimentation. Thomas Brennan's story reminds us otherwise. The young carpenter's son who endured mockery for his silly idea understood something crucial. Wisdom isn't about age or experience or credentials. It's about asking better questions, testing assumptions carefully, and having the courage to act on evidence even when it contradicts conventional wisdom. His neighbors called him foolish, until winter proved him right. They dismissed his heavy stone mass as wasteful, until it heated his family for 35 days from a single fire. They trusted their experience over his innovation, until their experience proved incomplete. The valley's builders eventually learned what Thomas had known from the beginning. Dismissing new ideas as primitive or impractical often reveals not the innovator's ignorance, but our own. Before you go, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button if this story taught you something valuable. Second, subscribe to this channel because we're diving deep into forgotten frontier wisdom that modern engineering is only now rediscovering. And third, this is important. Comment below and tell me, what old survival technique do you think deserves a comeback? What piece of traditional knowledge have we forgotten that could change how we live today? Your comment helps this video reach more people who need to hear these stories. So drop your answer below, and I'll see you in the next one.